for the very kind introduction. I'm not sure if I can live up to all of that for redistricting, but I'll do my very best. I'd like to start with the first slide, if I could, and just let you know that today I'll be talking about the relationship between the 2020 census and some of the anticipated delays that we have in the release of census data and how that's going to interact with the redistricting process. So in the next slide, I'll let you know, although people generally understand, if we could go to slide 2, please, if people generally understand that there is a connection between the census and redistricting, but sometimes after that, it gets a little intimidating. There seems to be math involved, possibly computers, and I want really, I think today, if I have one message to convey, is to really jump into the subject because it's not as technical as you think it is. And so this is my first slide to help you kind of ease your way into the topic of redistricting. And the reason why there is sort of a relationship between the census and redistricting is because we redraw political boundaries every 10 years after we get the census data. And why do we redraw political boundaries? It's because the Supreme Court has understood the Constitution to guarantee something. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, one person, one vote, right? Or before we used to say one man, one vote, but now we say one person, one vote. And that means that political districts have to have about the same number of people in them from district to district within a certain type of representative body. So when we get new census data, we take a look at the shifts that have been happening in population and we redraw the boundaries so that we can equalize the population from district to district. And this guarantees a type of political equality that's really important in America. So next slide, please. Sometimes people will ask me what types of representative bodies are redistricted and which types are not. So you'll see here a list of the types of bodies that we redraw political lines for, and they include our congressional seats, and this is an example for Texas, our Senate seats, our Texas House seats, State Board of Ed. All of our counties do get redistricted, and most of our cities and most of our school boards. And although I'll be talking primarily about statewide redistricting today, I always encourage people to pay attention to what's happening with redistricting at the local level, because the way that the political boundaries are drawn in our cities and our school boards can really make the difference between having a representative that is chosen by the community sitting on that board and talking about themes and topics that are really important to that community. Next slide, please. This is just an example of what political boundaries look like. And the example that I chose for you is from Texas congressional districts. And one thing that you're going to notice right away is that they are of different sizes. And you're thinking, well, Nina said before that they all have to have roughly the same population in them. And what this map shows you is that we have some areas of the state that are more sparsely populated. And so to get to that ideal number for a congressional district, we have to take in more geography. In this case, what you're seeing is county boundaries. So when you look at the cities, whether it's Dallas or Houston or San Antonio, you're going to see that the districts get really small because the population is dense. But in the areas where the population is spread out, the districts are bigger. Now, when they were drawn, they had, because this is a congressional map, exactly the same number of people in them from one district to the next. But I promise you that when the 2020 census data comes out, we're going to see that some of these districts have more people in them than when they started, and some districts have fewer people in them. Next slide, please. So what's really at stake when we talk about counting people for the census is just this raw idea of political representation. The more people that we count on the ground, the more likely it is that there will be a representative seat located in that area somewhere. So it's very basic. The more people you count in a particular area of the state, the more likely it is that one or more districts are going to be located there. Next slide, please. So I want to talk for just a second about why getting counted is important, because, for example, minority communities are not the only folks with a stake in redistricting, right? We have areas of the state that are faster growing, and in redistricting, they want to pick up representation. They want to see a shift of seats in their direction, whether that's South Texas, which is growing faster. If you think about Texas and you draw a line right across the state from El Paso going all the way through San Antonio and then curving down to Houston, that bottom half of the state is growing a lot faster than the top half of the state for a lot of the reasons that Lila mentioned in terms of demography and rates of natural increase. So the bottom half of the state is kind of interested in getting some more political representation compared to the top half of the state. But when we look at a more local level, we might see that suburbs, which are faster growing than inner cities, might also be interested in getting more political representation out of this new cycle of redistricting that we're going to get into. Then we have incumbents whose primary drive, although they will talk to us sometimes about issues, survival is probably the strongest instinct of any elected official, and they want to get reelected. So they want to see the political boundaries happening a certain way, right? Local jurisdictions don't want to get cut up. Cities and counties want to remain whole. Minority voters want to elect candidates of choice. Political parties want to maximize the number of seats for their political party. And even business interests like ranching and agriculture want to see district lines drawn a certain way to maximize their influence as well. So if I can introduce a sports analogy at this point, think about the Super Bowl. Think about what you see when you look at the Super Bowl. You see two football teams running around on the field with one ball. In redistricting, we still have one ball, but it's probably more like 7, 8, or 9 different football teams all on the field at the same time, all trying to get their hands on the ball, all running around in different directions. It is fast, it's chaotic, and it's very exciting on a certain level. And the stakes are very, very high. Next slide, please. So here I set out for you, and you can see some of the dates that we would normally have in a traditional redistricting process. And Texas redistricting traditionally is very crunched for time, because in December, we would expect to know how many congressional seats we have and what our total population is. Then within 2 weeks, the Texas legislative session starts. Everybody waits with bated breath for the redistricting data to come from the census. Typically, Texas is a priority state, so we will often get it by the 3rd week of February. The session ends in May. You can see that is a very short period of time to adopt a redistricting plan. There has always been litigation, and in every cycle of redistricting, Texas has been found by the courts or by the Justice Department as having discriminated against Latino voters in every cycle since Texas has been required to redistrict after the census. So the 70 cycle, the 80 cycle, the 90 cycle, the 2000 cycle twice, and then the 2010 cycle twice. Texas has been found responsible for discriminating. So we can always hope for institutional memory on their part, but assuming they don't have it, we will see litigation. And then you can see how short a period of time there is for even the court to resolve any potential problems, because by October, the precinct boundaries are being drawn. By December, candidate filing closes, and by March, we have our primary. The next slide, please. The reason that I drew lines through a couple of these deadlines is that the Census Department has asked Congress to adjust their deadlines. These adjusted deadlines from December to the end of April to find out total population and congressional apportionment, and then for the receipt of the redistricting data by Texas from the Census Bureau, throws everything into chaos. The Texas legislative session may end before Texas even gets its redistricting data. We may have no time for litigation. or we may have to push all of our traditional deadlines by court order. So it does appear that if the census convinces Congress to extend these deadlines because of the pandemic, we're going to have a very different, possibly more rushed and even more chaotic process in Texas for redistricting. Next slide, please. So what does it mean? It means less time, less process. The legislature may be rushing even more than typical. We may have a special session during the summer where it's going to be even more pressure on community organizations to get themselves organized and get themselves to Austin with maps in hand, which is a heavy lift. We also have 2 initiatives from the Trump administration to alter or manipulate census data. One of them has to do with what's called differential privacy. I don't want to scare you with words of many syllables, but basically the administration is attempting to alter the census data under the argument that they are making it more private, but it's actually going to change how the census reports whether people are really existing in their communities or not. And then the second one is that the Trump administration would like to report non-citizen information and is really openly inviting jurisdictions to start to try to subtract non-citizens out of census data for the purpose of redistricting, which would be absolutely devastating for political representation of any geographic areas that have a substantial number of non-citizens living in them. Right now, the citizenship issue is being litigated by MALDEF. The differential privacy issue, I think, is going to get litigated. The National Conference of State Legislatures just wrote a letter to Congress urging them to do something about the manipulation of data through differential privacy. And little or no time for litigation, which is my last point. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. That concludes it, and I look forward to having more of a conversation in the Q&A.